Hello and welcome to Good Words, the Geek Embassy's video series on how to write well. I'm your host, Regina McMenomy, and I'm here with author Evan Graham.
Hello.
And today we're going to talk about a specific aspect of character. We're going to discuss protagonists and antagonists. You've probably heard these words thrown about, or people have used them maybe in discussions of books you've read or TV shows or movies you've seen. So today we're going to come up with a definition and demonstrate maybe some of the uses for protagonists and antagonists in our favorite works of literature. So to start, Evan, why don't you give us a running definition of protagonists?
Well, basically, generally your protagonist is the main character of the story. It would also be the hero in most cases. It's whoever the story kind of centers around, whose actions drive the plot, who the plot primarily affects the most directly. It's your central character, the one that the story is about.
Yeah. And whose actions influence where you go in the story and sort of what happens a lot of the time. Yeah. If you're reading something and it's told in first person, so it's speaking in I, generally that person is your protagonist. As a really easy, sort of straightforward way to identify a protagonist. If it is in first person, it is. Generally, that person is your main character, your protagonist.
You can have a story with a narrator that is not the main character, though.
Yes.
A little different. You don't see that as often, but it does happen.
Yes, definitely. And you can have, a narrator who's not a participant in the story.
True. You can have a narrator who just is the narrator and
exactly.
isn't even really a person.
Yeah, who's not even a character in the story whatsoever, who's just standing out there. But often a first-person narrative is from the protagonist's point of view. What kinds of things or what kinds of characteristics do we generally see with our protagonist?
Usually our protagonist is supposed to kind of be an idealized version of you, more or less, as a person. Like they're the sort of person who you're putting yourself into their position as a reader,
right,
or also as a writer. It's often the protagonist is kind of the outsider in their own story in sort of a way. Like they're the audience's eyes to what's going on in the world in the fictional world. So they're the one who you're kind of meant to, if you're going to see yourself as any character in the story, it's probably going to be the protagonist, because that's part of what they're there for.
That's part of the construction of a protagonist, is to have that empathetic relationship with the reader or the viewer, where you are able, like you said, to put yourself in the protagonist's shoes, to walk around, to either agree or disagree with the decisions and choices they make sometimes. Sometimes the protagonist can alienate you if you wouldn't make the decision that they would make.
Yeah, sometimes you can have characters that are completely the opposite of that. Sometimes the protagonist of the story is a jerk. Like that happens sometimes, and that's always kind of nice. Like when your character, the central character, is just unrelatable and nasty. Usually it's something that is a part of their character arc that changes over the course of the story. They start off as this woefully inadequate person, and by the end of the story, the events of the story change them into a better version of themselves. Or it can even be the opposite. It could be somebody who starts at a high point and over the course of the story is changed by the events to a point where they're no longer someone that is relatable. Or like I'm thinking of like Frodo in Lord of the Rings. He starts off as kind of an everyman kind of character. By the end of the story, he's been through so much, he's kind of no longer himself.
Right, and he also doesn't relate to people anymore. Like he has changed so much and been through so much trauma himself that he doesn't relate to his friends, to Gandalf, to anybody the same way that he did before.
Which is in a way kind of a relatable thing. Mm-hmm. Like people, real life people who go through, like obviously in real life, you don't have the issue of being burdened with an evil ring of power that you have to drag up to
Well,
a
I don't
volcano.
know. Maybe. No, just kidding.
Most people won't experience that. A
Right.
small populace, maybe.
Yeah.
But like, you have issues where you might be. It's essentially his story is one of a loss of innocence, where he starts off in this comfortable home, this comfortable environment. It's a very the hobbits live a very comfortable life. It's part of their. It's basically their thing. It's what they
Right.
ideologically.
It's who they are. It's like the defining factor of a hobbit is second breakfast.
Right.
Right.
And that's like their worst thing that could possibly happen is they don't get one.
Right.
Like they have very simple lives, and his life is completely turned on its end, largely against his will. And over the course of his life from then on, he experiences danger and hardship and heartache and all kinds of things that change him as a person. That happens in real life too, all the time. It's sad when it happens in real life, but it does happen. And I think fundamentally, all stories deserve to be told, and the ones that have real bearing on real life situations are particularly so. So that's a story where the protagonist experiences something that in real life we wouldn't want to have happen, but it does happen in real life, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's something that ought to be represented.
Yes, it's the exaggerated metaphor for the journey that we all go on in some way. Well, most of us go on, where you take that step out of the Shire. That's like one of my favorite moments in the movie is where Sam comes to a stop and says, "This will be the furthest away from home I've ever been." And the profound depth of that moment of literally like it was the literal moment of stepping that far away from home. That is the metaphor really that just carries through the whole movie and the whole book. And I will just admit I haven't read the book, so it's always going to be the movie for me. I know. Look at your face.
Give me your geek card right now.
No, I need
right
it.
now.
I know.
That is unforgivable.
I know. I've tried like 3 times. I picked it up to try to read it, and I just I'm blushing thinking about this. I just have a hard time with certain narrative styles, which we can talk about in another episode of Good Words. Let's not get into that one now, but we'll talk about that later. Let's talk a little bit about antagonists here. We've got a lot of time we just gave to protagonists, so let's talk about antagonists. A definition of an antagonist is the character pretty much that tries to overtly, usually, complicate the protagonist's way. Somebody who gets in the way, somebody who makes it difficult for that character to journey forward. Frodo would have had several antagonists, not the least of which was just the environment itself that he was working against. But he had several characters who kind of would have been getting in his way as he was going on his journey.
Right. Obviously, the most obvious one is Sauron, the Dark Lord, the one who inhabits this ring that's slowly destroying him and that seeks to destroy the entire world. Sauron's definitely a villain, but there's also antagonists that aren't villains.
Right.
That are sort of serving to kind of be obstacles in the hero's journey. You can have entire stories that don't have villains but still have antagonists.
Antagonists, yeah, exactly. Where it isn't such good and bad, because that's one of the things that makes protagonists and antagonists interesting, is the dynamic is not always black and white.
Right. Like maybe it's a romantic comedy where the antagonist is the future mother-in-law who's just unbearable to be around. She's not evil, she's just unbearable and is causing obstacles to happen for your protagonist. Or maybe it's like maybe you have like a buddy cop movie kind of a thing where the two main characters are kind of each other's antagonists because they keep causing each other difficulty in the story. There's probably also a villain in there, like some bad guy that they're both trying to hunt down, and like by the end of the story they resolve their differences and are no longer antagonistic toward each other, but they still kind of serve as both protagonists and antagonists in that kind of a dynamic. Yeah,
I'm thinking of Sherlock Holmes right now in terms of thinking about a complicated protagonist, because we don't always relate to Sherlock. because of his like extreme intelligence, because of his lack of empathy. He's not always the protagonist that you go, ooh, look. Although you may dream of having the kind of intellect that he has and the kind of reasoning skills. Often his antagonist is the actual police force.
Oh yeah, Lestrade.
Yeah, exactly. Lestrade, the people who are the actual police that are working, who have more or less interest in having him help them out. Sometimes Watson is the antagonist, who's saying, you got to keep your head on straight here, dude. And then you have your villain, your Moriarty, who is the bad guy, but who is not always, he's not always the person getting in Sherlock's way.
Mm-hmm. And you can also have stories that are completely flipped around, where the villain of the story is the protagonist and the hero of the story is the antagonist. I'm thinking of Dr. Horrible, for instance. The whole story is about a villain being a villain, trying to become a villain. He's still relatable. He's still the protagonist, the main character that drives the action, but he still does some bad things.
Yes.
And the quote-unquote hero is the antagonist of the story, who also does some bad things, but fundamentally he's supposed to be on the side of good and righteousness, and the story is kind of about the inverse dynamic between them. Yeah.
Well, and the idea that you can be good, quote unquote, and still abuse the power that you have.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's, and leave it, of course, to Joss Whedon to knowingly subvert everything we're talking about in this series.
It's kind of his thing.
It is kind of his thing, taking, when he talks about creating Buffy, taking the blonde who usually trips and falls and dies first and making her the hero. That really is his whole approach, his whole storytelling approach, which is why we love him so much. Yeah. I have a more fangirls moments.
I fangirl over Joss Whedon too, so it's okay.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, I think that gives us a pretty good foundation for protagonists and antagonists. If you're watching the video and you're interested, please give us any questions. We'd love to do some follow-up videos to these. So protagonist, antagonist was what we covered in this topic, and look for our next video soon.